Hello, welcome to my final anthropology vlog for Anthropology 101. Um, so today I'm going to be talking about how nuclear weapons have impacted the small communities surrounding the Soviet Union test site, the Polygon, in eastern Kazakhstan. But before we get into that, I want to talk about how nuclear weapons and um, everything that surrounds them, the discourse, the conversation, blah blah blah, how any of that has impacted me or is relevant to me. And so I'm a Seattle native. I have lived in Seattle my whole life. I've never moved, and now I go to UW in Seattle. And I had never heard of Hanford before I took this class. I did not know that there were more than a few tests of nuclear weapons in the entire world ever. Nonetheless, over 1,000 by the United States alone. I did not know about the Marshall Islands, and that just really surprised me because I've had a very liberal education in the Pacific Northwest. I always thought of myself as very educated, knowledgeable about topics like these, but I was very wrong, very uninformed, and although this hasn't impacted me directly, like the effects of nuclear weapons and radiation, things like that, like seeing how it has affected other parts of the world through an anthropological lens was crazy to me. It was a crazy experience, and I learned so much from this class. And so the impact of nuclear weapons can kind of be put into a timeline by kind of categorizing where the main impacts come from. And so I came up with this. It's basically, so there are development sites like Trinity, there are test sites like the Marshall Islands, like the Polygon, and then there are purposeful detonations like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that was really all I knew about nuclear weapons was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It didn't occur to me that they would need to test them. And then there's waste storage, such as that giant concrete dome in the Marshall Islands that we read about in Bravo to the Marshallese. And then there are meltdowns like Chernobyl and Fukushima. And then, as kind of the culmination of all of those categories or like steps in the nuclear process, there's like the lasting impacts of radiation and contamination. And so the community I'm focusing on was a test site. So it is in eastern Kazakhstan and is the small community surrounding the test site known as the Polygon. So this Soviet test site was active from 1949 to 1989, and over 460 nuclear bombs or nuclear weapons were detonated there. And there were 200,000 people living within 45 kilometers of the test site. And so the Soviet Union took advantage of these people. It just like reading the interviews that we'll get into later, it was just very surprising, and it really reinforced the ideas that were put in place by Fedorak of power relations, and what we talked about in class about how nuclear conversations, there's always somebody up here and there's always somebody down here. And so what seemed really applicable to this situation was two of Nader and Gusterson's four principles of nuclearism, and those were othering and secrecy, because you can't take somebody's home and turn it into a nuclear weapons testing site without othering them first, because you'd never do that to your own hometown or village or wherever you came from. You just wouldn't, because you wouldn't want to ruin the lives of everybody who lived there. And then the secrecy surrounding this whole deal. And obviously there's a lot of secrecy within the Soviet Union to begin with, like the KGB and whatnot. But the secrecy here is that the villagers had no idea what was going on. They were not informed of anything. They were not informed of any of the health impacts, long-term impacts, or even when the bombs were going to go off. And so what I want to preface this next bit with is the first article in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Which is as follows. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Although I don't like the gendered language, that statement should hold true for everybody. It doesn't matter, where you come from or who you're interacting with, but you should treat people as you would want to be treated. It sounds childish, but that's just a rule that I have always lived by. And obviously, if you're turning somebody's home into a nuclear test site, you are not treating them as you would treat or as you would want to be treated. And so the villagers here, or the villagers there in Kazakhstan, if they were compared to the reference man from the cram reading, they would be well over the safe amount of exposure. So not only were they not protected, but they were treated as human guinea pigs, and they were instruments of the study for the betterment, for the furtherment of the Soviet Union in case the Cold War turned into nuclear war, which thank goodness it didn't. But I read an interview with one of the villagers, and this man, his name is, I'm sorry if I mispronounce this terribly, but his name is Eli Ghazi Nurgaliyev, and he's now 82 years old, and he's from the village of Kanar, which is very close to the test site, the polygon. And so when he was a young man, mid-20s, him and 42 other young men were left behind when the rest of the village was evacuated before the first test. And nobody knew what was going on. Everybody else was evacuated by the Soviet soldiers, and you don't really question that when you don't even speak the same language. And but these 43 young men were left behind, and they were given food, drink, music, and told to enjoy their picnic. Who's going to say no to that? How wonderful, right? And then, while they were enjoying their picnic, within 10 kilometers, less than 10 kilometers away from them, a bomb went off, an open air test. And then a little bit later, later into the night, the soldiers came back and rounded them up, and they were not told anything that happened, despite how aggressively or frequently they asked. They were told nothing. And so most of these people died very soon after that, and others lived for a while but then developed radiation-related illnesses and died later. Eli, I'll call him Eli just to make it, easier, is the only one still alive, and he is suffering from radiation-related illnesses currently. And this is just a gross misuse of power, in my opinion. And there's no conversation around it. There's no discourse between the villagers and the Soviet government. They had no power to question the absolute authority that was instilled in the government. And seeing this happen on such a large scale is just crazy. But those immediate impacts that occurred on the land, the contamination after the open air test, the first one, and the radiation that was then instilled in the villagers that were still there, was not the only impact that this test site had. And so obviously it contaminated the land. There are still huge craters with contaminated water. You can't grow anything, you can't drink the water. It's basically uninhabitable. But even after this test site was shut down in 1991, when Kazakhstan gained its independence, the children of people who underwent this radiation and lived in this horrible time are still suffering from it. And one young woman who's actually born in 1991, the same year that the site was shut down, she's now 26, and her last name is Pakazad. She was living a fine life until she was 18 years old, and her bones just started growing and growing, and she went from a European size 37 to a 43 shoe size in under 5 months. And she recently developed diabetes, and the doctors just discovered a tumor in her neck near a main artery, and it's unoperable. And she said that she wanted to get married and have children, and that was really all she wanted, and she just wanted to live a happy life with a family, and now that's completely out of the question. In a quote from her, she said, "The polygon took away my life." And if that's not, nuclearism in a nutshell, I don't know what is. but the severe radiation that these people suffered caused cancer, bone growth, birth defects, and complete loss of the life that they were familiar with and whatnot. And anyways, so the impact on the community in general, they evacuated everybody, which has its own obvious impact. And from the hog reading, many of the themes were extremely relevant, such as the death and uncertainty that nuclearism creates, and there's just no getting around it. And the Fedorak quote also, I mentioned it earlier, but it says that popular culture is always part of power relations, and popular culture in this case at the time was the Soviet Union. That's who held the power and who held the influence over these people, even if it wasn't what was popular, it was still the popular culture. And when we look at other cases of this, like the Marshallese, and we look at the damage to the community, the loss of ancestral heritage, culture, loss of language, and the physical damage, and how, as we read in Bravo to the Marshallese, they had to come up with new names for birth defects, like narwhal, grape, jellyfish babies, and the like. It just shows the clear devastation that nuclearism has brought on so many people. And although this was very depressing, there's still hope for the future. I know that radiation is a tough thing to get rid of, but if we make people more aware of issues like this, things can get better. And basically, that's my vlog. Thank you for listening.